Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. This week, I am discussing Beethoven's fourth cello sonata, which is the first of his Opus 102 sonatas for cello and piano. As the musicologist Lewis Lockwood notes, these cello sonatas are known to every player and listener as the last of Beethoven's accompanied sonatas for any instrument. Written in 1815, they are typically characterized in the literature as harbingers of the late period, introducing its typical density of ideas, its close, often abrupt juxtaposition of extraordinary varied elements. The second of these two sonatas, in D major, is probably the more normative of the two, and it's for that reason that I've chosen to examine the first in C major. Lockwood claims that these sonatas, as well as some other concurrent works of Beethoven's, are markers of the beginning of his emergence from a period of crisis and, gasp, even failure. He notes the cash grab of the Battle Symphony in 1813, the failure of Leonore, the death of his brother, and Beethoven's eventual failure to secure permanent guardianship of his nephew Karl as the cause of this crisis. And certainly, as we examine the form closer, I think it's possible to hear that in the music. I think we can especially see a link in the sonata to Beethoven's examination of a return to older styles of music. His late period, in addition to highly expressive music and elaborate formal constructions, is also often marked by the use of pastiche, or writing in past styles, the Baroque and early classical especially, for expressive effect. I think Beethoven is the first composer that suffered from musicologists linking his biography to his music, a trend that continues into today with Beethoven and every other composer and musician, and I don't feel like I need to add more to it than I already have. So let's get a little theoretical. The sonata begins with a slow introduction, movement. Although the sonata is presented in two movements, the autograph manuscript of this work is labeled Freie Sonata, while the second is simply labeled Sonata, differentiating between the more free first and the more traditional second. Keeping in mind the concept of the pastiche, you may remember from the late Baroque or Galant sonatas we've examined, Handel and C.P.E. Bach's, that a four-movement scheme was typical for sonatas. A slow movement followed by alternating fast, slow, and fast movements, often the second and fourth being in sonata form. I would say the layout of this sonata as a whole is generally in dialogue with that idea, but with some differences, of course, not least of which is the generative nature of this opening theme in the introduction. As you can tell, there's very little here that's in dialogue with the slow introduction. There is no dominant preparation, there are no sequences, or an alteration of heraldic and lyrical material. Rather, this is more in line with a through-composed first movement. There is one interpretive possibility that this section does have in common with the slow movement, and that is Hepokoski and Darcy's concept of the slow introduction acting as a representation of the world, or specifically, a herald to the fallen world. This beautiful and slightly pastoral, note the 6/8 time signature and relative simplicity of the harmony, can be seen as an initial condition, from which we may fall into complicated reality. A reality that, of course, can only be solved by a sonata form. The fall is into the relative mode of A minor, the aggressive primary theme initially strutting forth only to hesitate here and recollect itself to cadence. Considering the complicated back half of the exposition still to come, this theme is, more or less, tidy. The first complication arises here on this F sharp. You're no doubt wondering why I've chosen to label it as a medial caesura. Well, as we'll see, this is not a typical exposition. This is going to be a fairly rare Beethovenian continuous exposition. In fact, both sonata movements will be continuous expositions. The first, the more typical transition and Fortspannung merger. The second, the less common and very Haydnian cadential repetition variant. I think of this F sharp as being an attempt at a half cadence in G major, the dominant of the original key of C major. Of course, the sonata is actually in A minor, so a medial caesura pointing towards G would be extremely unusual, causing the music to flounder a bit. There is something sort of S-like here following the attempted medial caesura, and likewise you can see that harmonically it is in a kind of G major, but as the sonata continues, that key is rejected, and the transition devolves into Fortspannung. In their chapter on continuous expositions, Hepokoski and Darcy discuss the possibility of incipient medial caesuras. That is, cases where there appears to be an attempt at a medial caesura, and even an S, which ultimately fails. It is that concept which I feel has happened here, the medial caesura attempting, in a small, ultimately hopeless way, to reinforce the opening tonality of C major by opening the secondary theme space in G major. A valiant attempt, but one which ultimately fails. It will be even more interesting to see how Beethoven handles the corresponding section of the recap. But for now, we seem to be heading to the tragic option of the dominant E minor. As a bassoonist who sometimes lifts repertoire from the cello for my own purposes, I always think it's interesting how composers handle cadence points when writing sonatas for bass and tenor instruments. Beethoven, however, doesn't make a single choice in this regard. The cellist often acts as bass voice, as in this cadence, but will just as often be the highest voice in a structural cadence. In the run-up to this structural closing, the cello almost seems to lose their will. Carrying a held G through several bars, the cellist seems to be holding a torch for the initial major tonality, while the pianist focuses around an approach to the Neapolitan of F major. Emphasizing the Neapolitan can have a somewhat de-energizing effect, but the pianist carries through to the final cadence, where the rhythmic vigor of the primary theme reasserts itself as closing zone. One final thing to point out about this exposition is the potential link between these gestural flourishes and the opening motif of the first section. In a way, this closing theme is based both on the primary theme and the introduction. Note this gesture here in the middle of the first movement, and dust off your tenor clef skills if you need to. This is essentially a tonic to dominant gesture, which I believe is recurring here several times in the closing zone, and will be a major focus of the final movement. For the sake of time, I won't be diving all the way into this gestural analysis, but if you're interested, Robert Hatten discusses it in his book, Interpreting Musical Gesture, Topics, and Tropes, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert. You can find it cited in the description below. He includes a discussion of the generative nature of the opening motif and others in this sonata. The development is relatively short compared to the rest of the sonata, and the most notable aspect is probably the glorious initial return of C major, a much brighter iteration of the primary theme. This is the first moment where I felt a real sense of dialogue between the two instruments, or rather, the sudden lack of dialogue made all the previous dialogue more obvious. The cello suddenly stops short, and the piano is left to almost free associate its way to a retransition, which will open up the recap. The exact placement of this recap is a little debatable. I feel that it's most appropriate to place it where the primary theme returns, but arguably the primary theme never left us in the development, so you may feel this location, which has stronger correspondence with the exposition, is more appropriate. As we go into the Medial Caesura, however, there is a second link to the tonality of the introductory section of the sonata. An initial, and this time more typical, half cadence in the tonic is presented as a Medial Caesura. However, the music rejects it, moving to 3, C major. But how is this C major chord functioning? As a tonic, or is it rather a dominant to F? F major is the 6th chord in minor, but it's 4 in C major. And remember, an emphasis on the subdominant, 4, is a common feature of many recapitulations. The Medial Caesura is determined to return to the correct tonality, even if its only chance is a tangentially related key. F major is quickly subsumed back into the music, and the transition Fortspannung merger reappears mere bars later. As in the exposition, the cellist is holding out a C here, carrying a torch for the quote-unquote if only tonality of C major, which, it's now very apparent, the first movement will be unable to return to. This music isn't done yet, though. A brief coda makes one more attempt at approaching a chord which will open the path for a return to C major. The predominant D minor, 2, in C major, is the same as the subdominant 4 in A minor. It unfortunately collapses into the Neapolitan again for a final hammer blow cadence. In the first movement, we experienced the bliss of an initial condition, the introduction in C major, and experienced the fall into the inescapable A minor. Rhetorically, the second movement, again comprised of a slow introduction, which could really be called its own movement, and a faster sonata, has the weighty task of a return to C major on its shoulders. Although initially this seems easy, the movement opens in C major, it quickly becomes complicated. Cadenza-like melismas center around C and G major chords, but as the music continues, the thread seems to be lost somewhat, the cellist and pianist struggling to recall the initial world they hope to return to. The motive of the first introduction will return in part, and then in a hesitant version of itself in the piano here. As you can see, the cell of a gesture from the opening motif, which you can see in its original form here, is again appearing in both the cello and piano to reorient us toward the sonata form. It will comprise most of the material of the primary theme in this movement. As I said, this sonata is a continuous exposition, and similar to Haydn's Opus 9 No. 1 string quartet finale, is the second subtype, an early cadence followed by varied reiterations of the cadential material. Unlike Haydn, however, this movement has more sonic narrativity to it. Rather than reaching several perfect authentic cadences, highlighting the ease of completing the sonata, this exposition reaches several imperfect cadences. This is why I've marked sections with Fortspannung 1 to 4. Each section comes just short of the goal of a perfect cadence. In this way, this finale is similar to the ironic expressive doubling we experienced in Mozart's G minor quintet finale. But that movement did eventually end in success. Can this? Huzzah! A successful PAC in the major dominant mode. The frenetic closing zone sounds as a celebratory flourish before we head off to the development. However, Beethoven has something else in mind. The cellist has a lot of feelings to work through. I've labeled the coming section as an interjection. I think of it as being partially outside the form of the movement, even as it is intricately tied to the narrative of the whole. The cellist opens several disjunct harmonies, moving by major and minor thirds into A flat, the Neapolitan of the key we just left. I think of these interjections, and particularly the piano interruptions of the primary theme, as being almost like a kind of grief. My personal experience with grief, at least, mirrors how these open fifths suddenly appear. The sonata is going along fine, and suddenly you're disconnected from reality, wrenched back into a different time. Those around you try to jog your memory, and maybe they fail, but eventually they succeed, and you return to the action of the everyday. But the grief is still there, and in this development, it won't be ignored. Harkening back to the Baroque period, the development is contrapuntal, not a fugue, but more of a canon, the piano and cello entering at octaves here and here. This eventually ends in a chain of suspensions in the cello, which leads us into a retransition and the recap, which has a lot of correspondence with the exposition, so I won't butt in too much. As the exposition morphs into this Fortspannung, you can hear a corresponding emphasis on the subdominant, which, if you recall, was also attempted in the first sonata form. Similarly to the exposition, each Fortspannung section approaches cadence and falls just short of its goal. Now, this is where things get tricky. Here at this section is an IAC. The cello hangs onto this high G just too long and gets to low C on the and of beat 1. I draw your attention to this because it was this corresponding moment in the exposition where the first essential expository closure was. If we continue to the end of what, in the exposition, was closing theme, based on the primary theme, there is a second cadence here, which is a PAC. So the question is, which cadence counts? If the cadence in the exposition was structural, and what followed was closing zone, realistically, this point here should be the structural cadence. And if it is, it logically follows that this sonata is actually an example of sonata failure. If we readjust our expectations, however, this perfect authentic cadence here can be structural, and we can have a successful sonata. So what do you think? Can we change our expectations? Adjust to the world as it is, rather than what we would like it to be? Do we succeed, or do we fail? In this case, it's a matter of perspective. And this isn't the only moment in the sonata where Beethoven has fooled around with our expectations. Remember, the continuous exposition actually relies on our expectation of a medial caesura to obscure its own form even as it happens. And at the time of composition, in 1815, when the continuous exposition was far less common of a device, it would have been extremely subversive to the expectations of both performer and audience. Beethoven isn't done yet, though. The return of the following section is why I labeled this as interjection. I simply am not aware of any coda anywhere which begins with material that initially opened a development section. And I couldn't find any mention of it in Hepokoski and Darcy either. Of course, neither of those two facts means that this has never been done before. It may very well be, and almost certainly is, a device that Beethoven was aware of that I'm not. But either way, the coda, similarly to Mozart's coda in the quintet we discussed, which I'll link in the description, is a snapshot of the entire form. The experience of hearing only the piano dance around in the Neapolitan chord lends everything a very otherworldly effect, and I can only imagine how intensely different this would have sounded on a keyboard not tuned to equal temperament. When using a mean tone or wolf tone tuning system, C major and D flat major would almost sound as if they were on other sides of the universe. It's noteworthy that the piano cannot rouse the cellist to join them in a canon. Only by expanding the primary themes into its triplets does the cellist finally move into taking over the melody. As the cellist and pianist juggle around the motif from the introduction, you may have noticed that they echo the struggle of the second movement sonata form. Opening up the rhetorical drive to cadence on a dominant trill, they initially botch it, only to succeed on a gentler approach toward the end. I hope you enjoyed this analysis of Beethoven's Fourth Cello Sonata. Obviously, as I mentioned throughout, there are many ways to dissect this movement, and this sonata as a whole. If you disagree with my analysis, please let me know in the comments. As usual, you can find information on the performance, an abbreviation key, and my sources in the description below, and if you're able to support the channel, consider joining my Patreon.